For most of my life, I was really good at keeping the room comfortable. That skill served me. That skill helped me grow. It helped me build trust. It helped me to navigate a lot of tension. And that was until I started noticing what comfort was actually protecting. So I come from first-generation parents. My dad came from essentially nothing. No connections, no safety net. He fought his way through education and eventually earned a PhD in solid-state physics. And he was able to build a life to bring our family to the US. He created opportunity where really none existed. And with that came something somewhat unspoken, but powerful. And that was responsibility. I wouldn't say it was a loud pressure. I would say it's more of a quiet expectation. So I was really given a platform that he had to fight for. And somewhere deep inside, I was afraid of not rising to it, afraid of wasting the opportunity, afraid of disappointing the people who sacrificed for me. And if I'm honest, simply, I was afraid of failure, right? And that fear, for me, shaped everything. It pushed me to overcompensate, to overprepare, to anticipate objections before they surfaced. And I learned to manage perception. I learned to soften friction. I learned to avoid visible failure. And I felt that, if you push too hard and you miss, you create tension. If you challenge too openly and you get it wrong, you become the problem. So what I did was I learned to read people, to adjust tone, to keep room steady, and externally it worked. I was kind of the diplomat, the steady one, the operator. But internally, other things were happening, right? The fear didn't disappear. It turned into more of an obsession. So when failure was unacceptable, the improvement really became my new mandatory. I had to be sharper. I had to be the smartest person, the most prepared, the most controlled. And from the outside, it looked like I had a lot of discipline. But on the inside, it felt like a lot of anxiety. And I can't remember if it was on a podcast, if it was a book I read, or if it was just an interview, but there's an idea that I heard while listening to one of those where someone was describing the brain as a prediction machine and that it constantly guesses what will happen next. And when the reality doesn't match the prediction, that gap feels like failure. But that gap isn't punishment. It's feedback. So think about forecasting revenue. You build the model, you predict growth, you believe it makes sense, and then that quarter closes and you miss. That gap feels terrible, but that gap is the only thing that forces the model to improve. So if your forecasts are always right, that'd be awesome, but you're not stretching. You're just repeating safe assumptions. Growth requires gap, or it requires that gap. Growth requires visible failure. And that realization really hit me hard. So I spent years trying to minimize failure, but failure wasn't the enemy. Avoiding it really was my enemy. And I didn't know it yet, but that tension between managing the perception and confronting the failure would follow me into every boardroom I entered for the next number of years. So my first ambition and my first collapse. My first motivation, I would say, wasn't noble. It was money, right? It was validation. I came from a family that sacrificed for opportunity. I got into the top university, or one of the top universities. I got a really good competitive job in Silicon Valley. In my head, the script was clear, right? Good school, good job, make money, make your parents proud. And for me at the time, leaving school, sales really felt like the fastest path. You get to work with people, you work harder, you perform better, you earn more money. It was, in my eyes, kind of a simple equation. And early on, I did what high performers do. I studied the system. I memorized the script. I learned how to identify pain points, how to handle objections, and at the end of the day, I learned how to close. And it worked. The numbers were there, right? The trajectory was there. The validation was there. But the better I got at it, the more something started to feel off. The goal there wasn't really to help someone make the best decision. The goal was to get to a yes. So you were trained to steer conversations, to create urgency, to reframe hesitations, really to control the room. And none of it was illegal or outrageous, but it was very much transactional. And this is where I think my own kind of internal wiring started to clash within the system. I had grown up afraid of failure, as I mentioned, afraid of getting it wrong, afraid of underperforming, afraid of disappointing the people who believed in me. And I think with sales, it gave me a way to manage that fear. If I could control the conversation, if I could handle every objection, if I could keep the room steady, if I could minimize visible failure. But I started noticing something uncomfortable. We weren't learning from friction. We were trying to eliminate it. If a customer hesitated, that wasn't information, it was resistance to overcome. If someone wasn't a fit, that wasn't misalignment, it was a positioning opportunity. The system rewarded more persuasion than alignment, and that tension kept building. And at the time, I didn't have the language for it, for it at the time or knew what I was going through. I just knew that when you were winning, or you were winning by not serving, and winning and serving weren't the same thing. So years later, I actually came across a book. It was called Unreasonable Hospitality. And that book really gave language to something that, as I mentioned, I had already sensed. And that was that excellence isn't just efficiency, right? It's about serving beyond the transaction. It's about treating the relationship as more important than a close. So within that sales role, I made a small shift. I started to slow conversations down. I told people when we weren't the right fit. I stopped pushing for the deal. I treated it less like a quota and more like a stewardship, right? And ironically, that's when everything accelerated. Trust increased, referrals increased, retention increased. I became a top performer, not because I pushed harder, but because I aligned better. Managers then took notice. So I wasn't rejecting the system. I was quietly raising the standard inside the system. And that, I believe, was my first collapse, not of success, but of the belief that persuasion was the same thing as value. I realized something that would stay with me. If you blend into a system, you inherit that ceiling. If you challenge it even slightly, you raise it. The lesson would come back in a much bigger way later, which I'll get into. But first, let's get into section 3, and that is breaking point and kind of where and how I saw my rock bottom. So for a while, that lesson from the sales position stayed contained, right? Serve better, slow down, raise the standard inside the system. And it worked. But over time, something else started building. From the outside, everything looked aligned. Career was progressing, my income was growing, my resume was strengthening, and it was kind of in a position where everything looked good, but internally, there was just so much stress. And again, it wasn't too dramatic, but there was this low hum of anxiety where shorter sleep, Sunday nights felt heavier than they should, the Sunday scaries. And really what unsettled me wasn't the workload. It was the realization that I had kind of optimized myself inside a system that I didn't really believe in. So I made the decision that didn't make sense to a lot of people. And that was leaving a very steady, very financially rewarding role to start at the bottom in the advertising industry. So no reputation, no leverage, no performance history. Really, it was just curiosity. And that just kind of the belief that if I was going to operate in growth, I needed to understand how the machine actually worked. And once I got in there, at first I felt alive again, learning new platforms, studying strategy, understanding performance mechanics. I was a beginner again, and there was something honest about that. I began to rise within the ranks, and when I did that, I started noticing something very familiar, and that was that the system rewarded activity. It rewarded scale, it rewarded growth narratives, and sometimes growth narratives come before growth math, right? So we'd sit in boardrooms reviewing decks that looked strong, impressions rising, engagement climbing, reach expanding, and when revenue softened or margins tightened, the language shifted, right? We're still early. This is upper funnel. The algorithm needs more time. We're building long-term equity. None of it was technically false, as I mentioned, but it wasn't always aligned with the financial reality underneath. And here's what made it really complicated. It wasn't just one rogue agency or one bad actor. It was the industry structure. Agencies grow when clients spend more money. Revenue scales when more budget size. Frankly, momentum becomes the safest answer in the room. And when it's something that is that normalized, you stop questioning it. It just feels like how things are done. It wasn't until one day where we were sitting across from a CEO of a smaller business. So different room and different stakes. And we were recommending to increase spend, as we were told to do. The projections were rather optimistic. The narrative, I would say, was fairly polished, and he let us finish. Then he sat there, looked at us, and kind of in a stern voice said, "Just understand, you're not just adjusting a marketing line item, you're potentially adjusting whether I make payroll this month." And the room went quiet because suddenly math wasn't abstract. It wasn't about quarterly targets. It wasn't about platform learning curves. It wasn't about brand positioning. It was about the risk that wasn't ours. In that moment, something really clicked hard. So when incentives are misaligned, it becomes dangerously easy to justify the risk that isn't yours. Again, we weren't lying. We weren't stealing. We weren't acting maliciously. We were framing. We were smoothing. We were protecting the narrative. And I felt that familiar instinct rise again. keep the room comfortable. But this time, I felt like the comfort meant protecting the system instead of protecting the business. That was the fracture. Again, not explosive, not dramatic, but irreversible. I had already rebuilt my career once to find this kind of alignment, and I just wasn't going to compromise it. And I wasn't going to do it now just to keep momentum. So that was really my breaking point. Not because everything collapsed, but because I realized I was either going to keep getting better at defending a system that I don't necessarily trust in, or I was going to build something different. Section 4, my catalyst for change. So that moment in the conference room, it didn't make me angry. It made me honest. I couldn't unsee what I had just felt. I had spent years studying growth, how systems evolve, how performance compounds, how real improvement happens when you confront the gap of explaining it away. And I realized something, again, uncomfortable. The industry wasn't failing because people were malicious. It was failing because incentives were misaligned. Agencies again get paid on spend. Momentum is rewarded. Activity is productive. And when growth of a budget becomes the safest answer, it really becomes easy to frame underperformance as a strategy. I had done it. I had participated in it, and I'd helped polish the narrative, and I didn't want to get better at that. So I kind of drew a few lines for myself. If I was going to stay in this industry, I had to operate differently. I wouldn't work on a business I didn't understand, not just looking at the platform metrics, but really looking at the margins, the cash flow tolerance, the break-even point, the real downside. Because without context, optimization is just cosmetic. If the math doesn't work, I would say it. I would tell them, even if it slowed momentum, even if it meant spending less, even if it meant risking the account. I realized silence protects revenue and honesty risks the revenue. And I decided I'd rather risk revenue. And if I couldn't explain a strategy in plain language to a CEO, then to me, it wasn't mature enough yet. So I didn't want to hide behind attribution models. Didn't want any weaponized dashboards, no performance theater. And maybe most importantly, sometimes I felt like the right answer was restraint. You're scaling too fast. Your margins can't support this. Your assumptions are wrong. Those are frankly uncomfortable conversations. But I had already learned something years earlier. Growth doesn't happen when you eliminate the gap. It happens when you confront it. So I stopped trying to keep the room comfortable, and I started to try to protect the business. That was the shift. Not louder marketing, not more aggressive scaling, just alignment. That's what I did about it. I stopped playing along and I built differently. Section 5, proof of transformation. So when I decided to operate differently, I didn't know it would scale. It's easy to talk about accountability, it's harder to build around it. So early on, the first validation didn't come from awards or recognition, it came from conversations. I'd sit across from CMOs and founders, and I'd try to walk them through how I thought about performance. Margins first, cash flow first, clear math, clear timelines, clear trade-offs. And I'd see something different happen. They wouldn't just nod politely, they'd lean in, they'd interrupt, they'd say, that's exactly what we've been dealing with. The relief really was what I noticed most, because most of them weren't confused. They were what I felt was more overwhelmed by the complexity. They didn't need more dashboards, they needed clarity. Then the data started validating it. So instead of signing as many clients as possible, I focused more on depth, growing with partners, scaling responsibility, treating budget like it was our own personal capital. And I watched businesses go from cautious spenders to disciplined scalers, not because we pushed harder, but because the math finally made sense. So when you remove the narrative around inflation, growth becomes more predictable. When you align incentives, momentum compounds. What I'm most proud of isn't just the revenue. It's the restraint. It's the moments when we told clients to slow down, where we reduced spend before we started increasing spend, where we rebuilt assumptions before scaling. Because paradoxically, that's what builds trust. And trust scales faster than persuasion ever could. So over time, that approach, in my opinion, attracted the right people. Operators who valued clarity over theater, clients who valued partnership over optics, and the business started to grow. Not because we were louder, but because we were aligned. That was the proof. Not that performance first sounds good, but that integrity actually scales if you can protect it. So section 6, my second collapse, the success paradox. So for a while, that alignment held. Clarity attracted the right clients. Discipline really built momentum. The business started to grow, and growth feels validating, right? Revenue increases, headcount increases, bigger brands call, bigger opportunities show up. But here's really what no one tells you. Growth doesn't protect your principle. Really what it does is test your principles. As the business scaled, The pressure changed. Clients wanted guarantees. Teams felt stretched. Expectations grew. Pitches got bigger. Stakes got heavier. And slowly and subtly, I started noticing something familiar. Language softening. Decks getting prettier, messaging leaning safer, metrics being celebrated that looked good but didn't necessarily move the business. So nothing dramatic, nothing I would say unethical, just really small compromises made in the name of momentum. And in my opinion, that's what I call drift. Not a collapse, not a scandal, just inching away from your original standards because growth makes sameness feel safer. And there was one moment, I'm trying to remember exactly how it happened, but we were in a competitive RFP against another agency. And how it typically works, like if you have a friend within that company, you try to back channel. And a friend of mine actually shared that competing agency's deck. And we took a look at it and it was polished, it was confident, it was full of momentum language. And when I looked at ours, it was good, but it was much more opinionated, much more aligned with what we actually believed. But instead of doubling down on that, what we did is we went ahead and softened it. We adjusted the language, we reduced the tension, smoothed the edges, we made it look more like the other deck that we saw. Again, not because it was wrong, but it just felt more likely to win. And that's when I understood something very clearly, that drift doesn't announce itself. It really disguises itself as strategy. Like looking back at that example, neither of us actually won that pitch. The client chose a completely different direction. And sitting there afterward, I realized something important. Drift, again, doesn't guarantee success. It just guarantees sameness. Growth had quietly started nudging us towards the mean, towards what's expected, towards what blends in, toward what feels safe. That very thing I had built the company to resist. That was my second collapse. Not of business, but of clarity, because I realized something uncomfortable. You could build something principled and still lose it slowly without noticing. And from that point on, I became far more intentional. So we protect our standards the same way we protect performance. We push back on vanity metrics. We redefine success internally. We said no more often than not. We slowed growth when it threatened discipline. Because I learned something critical. Integrity doesn't scale automatically. It really has to be defended. And success makes that harder, not easier. And for the final section, my biggest life lesson. The biggest lesson I've learned building this isn't about marketing. It's about integrity under pressure. Integrity doesn't scale automatically. It has to be protected. And protecting it requires humility, because ego is what allows gaslighting to survive. Ego hides behind complexity. It defends strategy instead of questioning it. It avoids saying, we were wrong. But performance-first thinking requires that opposite. It requires learning the business deeply, not just the platforms, not just the dashboards, but the margins, the cash flow tolerance, the break-even point, the real downside. Because if you don't understand the economics, you're not optimizing. Frankly, you're guessing. It requires empathy, understanding that this isn't just a marketing budget, it's a payroll, it's a runway, it's someone's personal capital, and it requires courage. The courage to say that this won't work, you're scaling too fast, your assumptions are wrong, and we need to slow down. These aren't comfortable conversations, but comfort is what creates drift, the quiet erosion of your standards. So if you're a CMO or a founder frustrated with the traditional agency model, you're not crazy. You're likely reacting to the misalignment that I've seen. So if I can give you any advice, I would look for trader or partners who can explain trade-offs clearly, who can understand your business model deeply, that will tell you when to spend less when it's right, and that they don't need complexity to justify their value. Because performance first isn't about aggression, it's about alignment. And alignment happens when ego gets out of the way. That's what's changed for me, not the tactics, not the platforms, it's the posture. I stopped protecting the narrative, I started protecting the business, and from that point on, I built differently.